humanities, history is a social science as well as the humanities, but history majors are dropping. Even in Princeton, I think the number of history majors has dropped off. And which is, I think, a troubling thing. And Julian is one of these professors who gets students interested and brings it to life. And so how he does that is relevant to this, because you know about the great man theory of history? You all have heard about the great man theory of history. For a long time, that was the theory of history until it got, well, it was almost 100 years ago, started to get debunked by historians who said, you know, history's not really made by dead white males who are presidents and generals. History is made by social movements, poor people, middle-class people, all sorts of people, and that became mainstream history teaching. The people who wrote about the great man theory were popular historians. David McCullough, Walter Isaacson, me, although I wish I had sold more copies. You know, it was left to the popularizers. Now, there's all good reason for that, but history's kept on going. Not only do they not wanting to teach about the great man theory of history, they're even down on narrative. That writing narratives puts a false construct on history, that it distorts what really happened. Well, Julian has rescued narrative in this wonderful book that you ought to read, The Fierce Urgency of Now. This is a professional historian using a narrative to tell us the story of how basically Johnson got the Great Society passed. But because he's a good historian, he doesn't buy into the great man theory of history. In fact, he debunks that. He does a lot of debunking and creating of context, and it's a wonderful marriage of the discipline of history and the scholarship of history, but the narrative storytelling skills of the popular historian. If there was more of that, more kids would actually be interested in history. And so he's a very refreshing figure. Now we're going to apply that now to the Great Society. And let's start, Julian, by talking about this kind of notion that you often hear in Washington about the good old days. Wasn't it great in the good old days when the government really worked and that the executive branch and Congress really got along and foreign policy stopped at the water's edge and just wasn't it all great? Julian, talk to us a little bit about that particular bit of mythology.
Yeah, I mean, the book actually starts with Kennedy, when Kennedy's in office, and tries to show that's certainly not the Washington many Americans saw in 1963 and 1964. What many people talked about when they talked about Washington was a gridlocked Washington, a dysfunctional Washington, where a coalition of Southern Democrats who chaired most of the committees and Republicans primarily from the Midwest were blocking most of the measures that were seen as critical to the day, from civil rights to Medicare to education policy. And I found Life magazine in December 1963. It's the memorial issue for Kennedy, first issue out. And the lead article they have is The Lethargic Congress versus LBJ, and raising this question, will LBJ be able to get anything through this place? And so this was really the world of Congress for decades before
It wasn't
Johnson.
just Kennedy, and this goes back to 1937 or so, right?
Yeah, that's when this conservative coalition comes to power, both by controlling committees and having enough votes on the floor, and they block everything that's liberal. You had people like Howard Smith, who was the chairman of the House Rules Committee from Virginia, someone born on a plantation in Virginia, who blocked everything liberal, who the first thing he did when Kennedy took office was say, I'm going to use every power I have at my disposal to stop him. You had James Eastland, a senator from Mississippi, who used to joke that he had special pockets put in his pants simply to stuff all the civil rights bills that he wouldn't allow for a vote. That was Congress in 1962 and 63, and the frustration was just as great, if not greater, in some ways than what you see today because of the nature of the issues at stake, like racial equality.
Right, worth remembering. So so break the deadlock for us. What happened?
So Johnson comes into power, and one thing I have in the book, which I always want to make clear, is I do treat Johnson as an incredibly skilled politician, in large part because he spent so much time on the Hill. He was a creature of Congress. He was someone who understood the institution, had great relations with members, even his opponents. But the big thing that happens is the civil rights movement, and I think that has to be put front and center in 1964. The passage of the Civil Rights Bill, Johnson is essential, but so is the pressure that the movement is placing on members of Congress at the grassroots, including Republicans, and in Washington. A kind of mobilization and lobbying from religious leaders to union leaders to activists like King, counteracting all the tricks that the Southerners were trying to play when they filibustered civil rights. So the movement's the first part, and the second part is the election of '64. It's basic math, but the Democrats come out of that election with huge liberal majorities, 295 Democrats in the House, 68 in the Senate, and liberals have the balance of power. The Southern Democrats don't. And the Congress is ready and eager to push all these bills that they'd been discussing since Johnson had been Senate Majority Leader in the 1950s.
What are some of the ways they pressured? How did this grassroots movement actually pressure Republican congressmen? What did they do?
Well, in '64, one of the stories I talk about is the role of religious leaders from the Midwest who were affiliated with the movement. The key to getting the filibuster to come to an end was having enough Republicans to vote against the filibuster. And a lot of civil rights leaders knew that African-American protests wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be sufficient, although they did hold protests during this period. But religious leaders were very important. So national religious leaders coordinated with local ministers in places like Illinois to have sermons every week, talking about the theme of civil rights and asking congregants to write their members and say, let this bill come up for a vote. Religious leaders and union leaders would sit in the galleries of the Senate to monitor and watch before C-SPAN exactly what was going on. They'd round up members whenever there was a quorum call to make sure that the Northern Democrats could get back there on time. So there was that kind of, not just the protests, but actual lobbying and putting pressure. And it was very effective. Hubert Humphrey said it was the religious leaders who turned a lot of Republicans against the filibuster.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because we think of the TV images of the protesters and all that, but there's a lot going on the Hill as well in terms of, and then, so talk to us about Johnson's role. Again, this is in our mythology, Johnson is the great man who can twist arms and get it done, the master of the Senate, the Caro vision of him, if you will. So what was his actual role in getting this stuff done? Put Johnson in this, the president in this.
I mean, there's a million stories of Johnson twisting arms, doling out pork, and all of that takes place. But what struck me about Johnson and what he understood was both the limits of his power and the importance of moving very fast when the opportunity emerged, both with the movement and then with the election, to get as much possible, because he always understood the window was going to close. He was very sensitive to the fact that this liberal moment was just a moment and it wasn't going to last forever. So one thing he does is he sees the movement, we could talk about Selma, as a partner, really. He sees King as someone who could help him, and he sees the movement as someone who can help him with voting rights to build the kind of support that is necessary in Congress to get the bills through. He works with liberals on the Hill, like Richard Bolling, who is the head of the Democratic Study Group, who are organizing and mobilizing to fight back against the Southerners. He sees them at this moment as key allies, not simply as bomb throwers, as he used to call them, who are going to cause problems for him. And then there's some negative parts. Some argue that with Vietnam, he also takes a hawkish stand in part to hold off conservatives during this key moment. But those are some of the things. But I think the fierce urgency, which the title of my book comes from a Martin Luther King speech, and it's the kind of ethos of civil rights, was also his outlook. And again, it wasn't because he thought his power was unlimited, but just the opposite. He was always saying, by the midterms of '66, Congress is going to get the best of me.
Well, this is a good time to walk through the movie a little bit. How many have seen the movie? A lot of you. Okay, so let's talk about what's true and right about the movie and what's wrong.
What's true, well, let me say, I think it's a terrific movie, very powerful, stirring film. And what's true is it captures both the nuts and bolts and courage that the organizing at the grassroots level entailed by really showing the kind of violence that confronted the protesters. And it captures how the movement often drove the timing of these debates back in Washington. What was fundamental was Johnson wasn't ready to do voting rights in March, and the movement really forced his hand and forced the hand of Congress to take it up right away. What's wrong is that Johnson was fully committed to voting rights and to a voting rights bill by the time this all happens. There was no ambivalence from anything I saw about him to this cause. After the election of '64, he tells Attorney General, soon-to-be Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, draft a very strong bill for voting rights. In February, Katzenbach negotiates with Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, and Everett Dirksen. They're getting the framework of a bill in place. So the debate was about timing, and I think the movie doesn't capture where Johnson was. And he seems ambivalent. He seems more focused on surveillance of Martin Luther King, and it gets that part of the story wrong.
The surveillance, as I recall, was really started under the Kennedys by Hoover. Was Johnson even involved in that, in the famous suicide tape and all that?
No, that all starts earlier. There is surveillance by the FBI under Johnson at the Atlantic City Convention of Civil Rights Activists, later on anti-war groups, also in conservative organizations. Surveillance is part of the landscape at this time, but the story gets, or it doesn't get it wrong. It clearly plays around with timing to put a story that really comes earlier under Johnson, and that compounds, I think, the impression that you get from the president.
Yeah. Do you think Johnson was cranky in the Oval Office with King, at least? Because there was a debate over timing. So did they get the sort of feel of that right?
Well, they actually use, I believe, I'd have to see it again, but they use some of the language from a phone conversation in mid-January where Johnson is saying, you know, I have this moment after the election. I want to get Medicare. I want to get education. He always says this is part of the civil rights struggle. These are not separate issues, but it's not time yet for voting rights. Not because I have 100 issues and this has to wait. He fears it's not going to, it's too much to overload Congress with two civil rights bills back to back. And again, it comes from Johnson not being cranky, but having a very keen awareness of the limits even of his power after this election. He's always concerned of how fragile this is. So there is tension between the two men because King does not want to let this sit and potentially die a legislative death. And so that's, I think, the nature of their conversations.
Yeah. I'm just curious whether you think this movie is a net plus. Is it?
I think it's a net plus. Look, at the basic level, my book and the movie have a similar argument about how Washington works and how you get a dysfunctional Congress to move, or Washington to move. And so I'm actually in agreement with the movie in terms of its theme. And more important, it stimulated a great debate. The number of times I've heard people talk about the relationship between grassroots activism and presidents and how do bills get passed outside the classroom or outside this city is very limited. And so because of this movie, it's triggered a really useful debate that even kids are having about how this all happened, what it means for today. And I think that's actually a net plus. And that's what Hollywood can do by often being provocative.
Yeah. Even if they're a little wrong, stirring the pot.
Yeah, so that's a good debate we're having. I think sometimes it veers off into polemics and each side's accusing each other of harsher rationales for why they're doing this. But at basic level, it's good to have this debate. And it's good a movie can do that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about now, relating then to now. Because now, the common perception, the common reality, actually, is that Washington's pretty dysfunctional and executive's not getting much done up on the Hill, and the Hill's not getting much done on its own. What can we learn from then that's relevant to now? Well,
once you get rid of the nostalgia about how things used to work, you can take a closer look at these years during Johnson's presidency where you have a kind of total burst of legislation. It's really nothing compares to it, maybe other than the New Deal. And I think the basic lesson is if we continue to expect a new leader, a new president, to remake Washington, we'll perpetually be disappointed. Because that's not really what happened in the mid-1960s. And it really took this huge mobilization, first with civil rights, and then not just with people voting for Democrats, but Republicans picking a candidate who really was the wrong candidate, Barry Goldwater, for the moment, and changing the conditions. We look today to different things. We look to the grassroots. We look to how do you remake elections. We look to how do you deal with things like partisan gerrymandering so that you could have bigger swings in elections rather than just hoping a Hillary Clinton, a Jeb Bush, whoever it is somehow magically going to change things. We saw in Obama's first year, when the Congress was hospitable, a lot of big things did happen. So the broken Washington did produce things when you had a more dynamic relationship between the Hill and the president. And I'll just conclude, another lesson is that the windows usually, I think generally the windows for doing a lot are short in Washington. Forgive me for everyone who's worked here, but I do think it's a difficult political system, and we have these moments when things happen, but the norm is not that. But one of the lessons is that the changes can last. I mean, the Great Society has been enduring. Today, most of the Great Society remains in place. Most of those programs, while some don't like them, are considered part of our status quo. And I think that's also a relevant lesson for today.
The part of this is a press issue. The press has created this feeling that if the presidential elections are everything, and it all plays into this idea that the man or the woman on the white horse is going to come in and rescue us from our fates. I mean, could we do things to moderate that rhetoric? Is there something more that the press could do to kind of alert people that this is not the be-all and end-all of the election?
It's hard because going back to your first question, there is something satisfying about the great man theory of politics. It's easy to understand. The storyline is clear. Someone comes into office every 4 or 8 years. They leave office. And you put all your hope and you put all your frustration in one person. Johnson has swung from being the ultimate villain of American history until recently when he's kind of the new superhero of Washington politics. I think it's easier to understand politics that way. It's harder to start to bring in Congress. It starts harder to bring in the procedures of Congress and how do people outside Washington impact what's going on inside. But I do think journalists need to work on this because ultimately that's where people get their news. There's some journalists, I think, in the modern age of blogs and websites who are trying to do a little of this work. But I think ultimately it's important because then you can see more clearly what has to change to get a different environment here.
I mean, it makes you wonder if there had been cable TV in 1964 and the internet, would it have been a different outcome?
The election, no. I mean, I think at that moment in history, Barry Goldwater was so far right. And again, this wasn't a totally liberal period in American
Even Roger Ailes couldn't have saved Barry Goldwater?
I don't think anyone could have saved. But someone actually asked me on an interview, what if there was tweeting and how would Lyndon Johnson's phone conversations have stood up to public scrutiny? That would probably, I don't know, but I think that would be quite difficult to imagine listening to this. They're very colorful stories he would tell people. I don't know if they'd want the president speaking that way. But I don't think, I think the media played a big role in the way things did unfold. So a lot of this was about television. The civil rights movement, as the movie Selma captures, really was driven by people seeing the images of the conflict, not just reading about them. Vietnam is a similar story. And of course, the '64 election, one of the things Johnson does is use the television spot incredibly well, not just the Daisy ad, which is famous, but yet other ads like hands tearing up a Social Security card and warning this is what you're going to get with Barry Goldwater, or clips of Goldwater flying back and forth to Washington just so he could vote against Medicare. And so that's another way in which the media actually shaped the story of the time.
Let's open it up to questions. Anybody? Yeah.
Thanks for the forum. Sorry about the chips. Mr. Thomas, your reputation precedes you, so it's my pleasure to put these questions. One question, but essentially in 5 parts. It's probably just There's a great image, I don't know who the shooter is, but Jeff Shessel on his cover for Mutual Contempt. There's this awesome shot of Johnson in the extreme foreground, Bob Kennedy in the background, and Kennedy's got his arms crossed, sort of looking very contemptuously at Johnson. To what degree did Johnson sort of see his role as being President, what's-his-face, sandwiched between John Kennedy and the eventual win of his brother from the Senate to the White House? Yeah. Another question, to tweak one of your fantastic pieces, to what degree was Johnson the seventh man in the wise men, six friends in the world they meet? You mentioned, sir, about Medicare standing, and a lot of people have this assumption that these government programs or these programs sort of were there the whole time. So how consequential a figure in that regard?
Well, let me take the first one, because there's an interesting point here. Johnson was driven crazy by the Kennedys. Doris Kearns Goodwin got this. His dream. He had nightmares about Bobby Kennedy. He was transfixed by the Kennedys. I'm writing about Richard Nixon now. Same issue. And to some degree, it's debilitating and bad, but it's also good. People need to be driven, and Washington is full of driven people. And maybe they're driven by their demons, but drive is not a bad thing. And Johnson's insecurities were a powerful rocket fuel towards success. Now, they could be debilitating. Nixon obviously had some problems in this area. But never underestimate insecurity and ambition as a positive driving force. I think Johnson's desire to surpass the Kennedys or live up to the Kennedys, or even if it was kind of crazy, was useful.
Yeah, I mean, Johnson is a creature of the New Deal. I mean, that's what the period that really forms his ideas, and he's determined not just to make sure Kennedy doesn't Bobby Kennedy doesn't, defeat him or displace him, but the way he thinks of doing that is to pushing for a huge legislative agenda. I do think it gave him energy, and it actually worked in his favor. Medicare is one of the most contentious issues of the time. Today it's seen as third rail in politics, like Social Security, but I have a lot of that in my book. The kind of mobilization of the AMA against Medicare.
Yeah, think about this. The organized medicine was against Medicare.
Huge. I mean, they called it socialized medicine. Ronald Reagan recorded a record where he talked about how healthcare would be the opening wedge to socialism in this country, and the wives of physicians in an operation the AMA ran would meet across the country and have coffee clutches where they'd warn people about Medicare, and they'd play Reagan's record. That was the centerpiece. It was the most expensive lobbying campaign until that time against Medicare. And the guy on the Hill who was the problem was Wilbur Mills, who was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee before his escapade in the tidal basin. His life ends with a scandal. But at the time, Mills didn't let it come up for a vote. Even in '64, after Kennedy's death, after Johnson's in office, Mills kills it again. And after the election, I tell the story of how Mills understood he was going to lose because this was an issue the Democrats were going to push. And so he turns and actually puts forth something much bigger than the administration ever wanted. But Medicare is really, and Medicaid comes out of this, is a very contentious issue. More contentious, I would argue, than the battle over President Obama's health care was.
May I have my last two very quickly, please?
Sure.
What was the deal in '60 that got John Kennedy so pissed to put Lyndon Johnson on the ticket? And could you look into how fragile Johnson's coalition was in March '68 that made him move to just give it all up?
Kennedy needed the South. I mean, Johnson brought that. And this was a region where he needed Johnson's help. And this was an area where Johnson had a lot of credibility. By '68, the last part of my book is on the period between the midterms of '66 and the election of '68. And that's when all hell breaks loose for Lyndon Johnson. And the conservatives are back in power in the Hill after the midterms. The last 2 years of Johnson's presidency are consumed with the battles over Vietnam and the guns versus butter debate, which is conservatives on the Hill were saying you're going to not only stop spending on domestic programs, you're going to cut spending if you want the money for Vietnam. And this consumes a lot of his time. By 1968, his coalition is very fragile. Vietnam is starting to disintegrate his coalition. His opponents, this conservative coalition, are re-energized, and their numbers are much greater than they had been in 1964. And electorally, I think it's uncertain how he would have done if he ran, but there was enough reason to think it might not have gone well.
There are funny kind of delayed reactions. I mean, I was looking at some numbers on liberalism. And liberalism kind of peaks in about 1965-66, measured by popular attitudes as the Great Society is passing. But then in the 66 elections, conservatives do pretty well.
Yeah, very well.
And all of a sudden, if you look at the liberalism curve, it goes down again.
Yep.
Nixon comes in, 68. Then liberalism goes back up again. Yeah. As people react against Nixon. Voters often react against the president who's there. Yeah. And by 1971-72, liberalism is back going up again, and Nixon has to respond to it and actually passes a lot of Congress, and Nixon passes a lot of liberal legislation, EPA and SSI and all sorts of things. And then it goes down again. Yeah. And so there can be kind of a delayed effect. You can, even though it's true liberalism had this sudden burst and then tailed off in 1966, but it comes back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's not neat and tidy the way we would like it to be. Yep. There are these kind of aftershocks and after effects. And Julian's point that, okay, it was a brief period, but the Great Society is still with us. Yep. It didn't go away.
Yep.
Anybody else? Yeah. Sir. You got it.
Thanks very much. I'd like to come back to the great man theory.
Yep.
And ask you both, actually, since you both looked at presidencies in some depth. If we can agree that the great man theory has died or moved to the left, we still, this is the royal we or the collective we still like to rank presidents, and we like to say there are great ones and awful ones.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm interested in is whether there is some tension between the notion that the great man theory really doesn't work with the notion that we still think, when you look at the 44 presidents, there is some way of categorizing them and saying some emerge as great. And coming back to sort of one of Evan's earlier questions to you is, if both are true, great man theory is dead, but there are some presidents that are greater than others, and perhaps Johnson was one of them, at least for a period of time, and you both looked at great presidents. What can we learn from those presidents or presidencies that were deemed great that might be instructive if we were thinking about trooping off to New Hampshire and Iowa for 2016?
My first response is I never participate in those rankings. So they always ask, how do you rank the presidents? Who are the top 10 presidents? What's the legacy of a president? And I don't like the question because I don't think it actually captures what happens in a period. The reality is our ideas of presidents good or bad or what they do change constantly. They're in flux. There's no fixed answer to these questions. So I just don't find those rankings very useful. They often reflect where people are politically at a given moment when they're asked the question. In terms of I don't like those, and I don't think they're that useful. Now we have a round of discussions of Obama's legacy, and I think they'll give us very limited discussion, like that New Yorker thing that came, the New York magazine thing that came out. Look, I've spent my whole career now trying to bring back political history. So I'm in an odd place in that I have a book saying let's not overemphasize the president on their own, but most of my career is at studying Congress and studying Washington, saying to the social historians, Washington matters. I think you have to understand presidents in context. That's really what I'm interested in doing. Understanding the relationship with Congress and the president, understanding the relation. That's when you get a real feel for what a president could or could not do. So again, going back to Johnson, what was amazing to me is once you put the context, you understand more of his skill better. I don't think it was just the arm twisting. I think it's his feel for when Congress is going to push back on him. It's his feel for understanding how he could work with the organized liberals on the Hill, who actually were great allies in moving a lot of this legislation. Same with the civil rights movement and unions. He understood how they could be partners. This was when he was at his best in creating the pressure that's necessary to get any piece of legislation. And part of the bad part of Johnson is when his political instincts lead him directly in the wrong direction, like with Vietnam. And you can look, if you start looking at presidents, this is what I want to do with the book, in a different way, not understanding them as these isolated figures in the White House who do all good and do all bad, but put them in the context of this city and put them in the context of elections and movements. I think then we could start writing really good histories of the presidency. Not writing them out of history, but just the opposite. You get a better flavor. And I still hold that Lyndon Johnson would have appreciated that in some respect, because that's the person I heard on the tapes who understood that's how the presidency actually works.
The cliche is war presidents. I mean, who was it? I think Bill Clinton said, I can't be a great president because I didn't have a war. War magnifies presidential power. And so we're more aware of the president in a wartime situation, but that is a distortion in the field that we hope we don't have too often. Back there, sir.
I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
And history has a way of quickening the urgency of now. Where does Eisenhower fit into this large narrative? And I was thinking, as I was watching the movie, Judge Frank Johnson was appointed by Eisenhower. So there are all of these very progressive judges who came to bear on the progression of the now in the civil rights movement.
Well, Evan can talk about Eisenhower, but let me say another part of the story. The influx of Northern liberals into Congress, into the House and Senate since the 50s is really hugely important to understanding the Great Society. In the 1958 midterms, for example, liberals do incredibly well. It's the generation that enters in the 50s. This includes people, Hubert Humphrey will end at the end of the 40s, but it's these liberals in the 50s who put a lot of the ideas that become the Great Society on the table. So there's a quote I have where when Johnson becomes president, one of the first things he says is, I want to make not just the bills that Kennedy proposed, but these ideas that have been circulating in Washington, I want to finally get them on the agenda. And it's not simply that liberals in Congress a decade earlier had been proposing this. They had been fighting for this. They had been crafting and redoing proposals to try to make them more viable politically. They had been organizing on the Hill so that when the time was right, they'd be able to finally counteract these Southern Democrats. This Democratic Study Group I mentioned, a caucus of liberals forms in 1959. So Eisenhower's one story with the judges, but I think you're right. You have to look longer to understand where these ideas come from. It's a kind of, one political scientist said that all the great ideas in Washington go through a period of incubation, usually, in Congress, where they're debated, they're floated, they're knocked down before a president ever picks them up.
Yeah. I think there's a sense of frustration in Washington. We're beating our heads against a door and nothing ever happens. Actually, it's a long process. And you need to keep on, the Aspen Institute and other institutions around Washington need to keep working on this stuff because it takes years. Civil rights being a case in point. Eisenhower played a long game. He liked doing things behind the scenes. He didn't want to have confrontation, but he salted in those federal judges to enforce the law, like Frank Johnson, who's in the movie and was a significant figure in Wisdom. I've forgotten their names, but there were a bunch of them, the Fifth Circuit. And so it's a slow process. The 1957 Civil Rights Act was a weak act, but it was a beginning. And Johnson had a piece of that too. Small steps, and then suddenly all the forces come together and wham, big steps, but then small steps. But those small steps are necessary. Yeah.
Jonathan Rausch at Brookings. I worked on the gay marriage issue for years, and the process you described, it could not have better encapsulated what happened. Johnson was a political animal, and I've always been puzzled by the anecdote attributed to him that when he signed the Civil Rights Bill of '65, he said, "There goes the South."
64. Yeah.
64. Did he really? 65? Well, did he foresee this realignment, and did he see it as Democratic Party political suicide, which doesn't sound like the sort of thing he would do?
I mean, the story comes after the '64 Civil Rights Act, when Bill Moyers finds him all forlorn and says, and doesn't understand why, and Johnson says, "I've just handed the South to the Republican Party for decades to come." And certainly I think he was cognizant, as Kennedy was when civil rights came up, that this was going to come at a cost where in the base of the Democratic Party, meaning the South. And in the '64 election, some southern states in the Deep South go to Barry Goldwater. So the effects are actually immediate. But I don't think it fully captures Johnson. I think that story doesn't also capture the optimism that Johnson felt about what these liberal policies could also do for the Democratic Party. And, you know, a lot of the campaign of '64 is about policy. It's Johnson touting the war on poverty, touting Medicare, and I think foreseeing that this would allow the Democrats to make inroads in Midwestern states, to certainly strengthen their base on the coasts. Martin Luther King, in a conversation with Johnson, even says, you know, if you fight for voting rights, you're going to increase African-American voting in southern states. They're going to remain loyalty. I think all that was part of Johnson's understanding, too. So I think the story captures part of his fears. But I also think he and other Democrats understood that there could be very positive electoral gains from what they were trying to do.
Having said that, there was political courage involved. I mean, I know from studying Bobby Kennedy in 1963, this is when the bill, the Civil Rights Bill, is launched in 1963 and it's the Kennedys seizing on TV. Remember, George Wallace was standing in the schoolhouse door trying to stop the integration of the University of Alabama, and the TV cameras were there. And the Kennedys go, okay, now's the time to strike. And he gives a speech that night. John Kennedy had not finished writing the speech launching the Civil Rights Act, what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He wanted to seize the moment. And in that discussion in the White House at that time between the brothers, there was a recognition that, you know, the base of the Democratic Party is the South. It took some political courage to push for an act that was, I mean, as Johnson said, that takes some guts or foresight or risk or gamble to say, we're going to take the base of our party and we're going to alienate it because of a moral cause whose time had come. They were grumpy about it. Jack Kennedy didn't love doing it. Bobby Kennedy was kind of goading him and pushing him. But there's that great line. It's as, what does he say? It's as old as the Scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. We have a moral obligation to do this.
I mean, it was courage and fear. And one of the things that I saw, the courage is absolutely correct. And Johnson, you know, he also understood that great victories in policy don't always mean political reward. I think we have that image, but it often costs to get stuff through. But, you know, the kind of protests and violence on the streets clearly created a sense in Washington of civil chaos. And, you know, Kennedy really moves after the Birmingham protests finally on a strong bill. And I think Johnson's in the same place. He understands this is going to cost the South potentially. He understands all the turbulence that's going to come from this. But I don't think they felt they had that many choices because of what was going on. Everett Dirksen says civil rights is an idea whose time has come, but it's not simply because he had this great, you know, intellectual moment of figuring this out. He was watching the same things on TV that everyone was watching at that time. And I think that's important to understand the mindset on where we were with race relations in those middle years.
Yes.
You hinted at this slightly when you were talking about that the Great Society took place at a relatively conservative era in America. And I'm just curious, you have folks like Rick Perlstein, who spent their careers trying to argue that the '64 election is the beginning of the unmaking of American consensus, that broad period of general comfort with an expansive, activist federal bureaucracy began to fray heading towards Reagan. Do you think that's actually true, or is that sort of retrospectively false, that America has always been kind of a conservative place that's hostile to a large federal government, and that just became more apparent in later years?
I think, look, Rick's a very good writer, and I like him a lot. And I think if you look pre-1963, though, to just make an argument, and I'm not sure, I mean, I think he's actually aware of this, but that conservatism, that anti-government forces are not very strong in American politics, just misses the record. So this isn't directed to him at all. It's just directed toward a very common understanding of the period. If you turn from the White House to Congress, you have a very different picture of where American politics was. On issues like civil rights, on issues like unions and unionization, this conservative coalition was knocking down everything. And so liberals were frustrated in the early 60s. They certainly didn't see a liberal America. And it wasn't simply because they wanted too much. They had overreach. It was because they saw exactly what the reality was on the Hill. And historians have been looking at other parts of American life, from intellectuals like Rusher and Buckley to activism in places like Orange County to a very good book about business people since the New Deal who were funding anti-New Deal programs. And conservatism, we're learning, was much stronger than we knew. It doesn't mean America was conservative, but it doesn't mean, it means it wasn't just liberal. It's more a civil war that's taking place in some ways between these two ideals. But once you bring Congress in the story, I think it's hard to say that '64 is the beginning of all this. Because if you just look a decade earlier, none of these liberal measures are getting anywhere. And the opposition is not mild. It's very fierce to getting any of this done.
Sure.
Shifting the focus from war history to today, and the theme, the urgency of now, power of social movements, which is certainly historically certainly valid. How do you see the urgency of now or the power of social movements in this country, given the Supreme Court decisions, Citizens United, Buckley versus Vallejo, and the problems facing our nation and our Congress versus the money which the Koch brothers and all have raised?
That's a really good question, actually. So one kind of version I've heard is the weakness of social movements for Democrats and for liberals, not for the right, that's lacking today in some ways compared to where Democrats were in the 1960s. You don't have a union movement of comparable power. You don't have a civil rights movement of comparable power. You don't have a liberal religious constituency of comparable power. But what you're saying is something different, that there's actually institutional changes that are going on in American politics that will counteract even a renewed period of activism, whether it's the influx of private money and lobbying in American politics to something we mentioned earlier with the nature of districts and the difficulty of swinging them. And I think those are all relevant and important. And so activism alone isn't sufficient. I think, one of the realizations of many liberals in the 70s was that government reform, congressional reform, was also going to be important. And that's when they weakened committee chairs and try to change the campaign finance system and create ethics laws. Part of the idea was if you don't change those institutional factors, in the end, the same forces that have power will continue to have power. So I think all the things you're pointing to certainly have to be up for debate if you're going to have another moment of change.
Let's maybe one more question. Yeah. Sir.
I'm assuming that you are teaching. I assume you're teaching this story to your classes as you are writing. Are they more interested in government service when they hear how complicated and messy it is, or are they appalled?
So I teach this, and I teach other I taught a seminar on this, and I teach other classes that deal with this, both to students at the Woodrow Wilson School and to undergraduates who are not. I think usually I get them more engaged, frankly, because I think many of them are disillusioned with politics, and they also think they just don't believe what they read on how politics works. And what I have found is the more real the class can get on how politics actually works, on how it worked in the past. And actually, as Evan said at the beginning, getting beyond just telling them FDR, Lyndon Johnson did everything. They don't believe that. When I give them a real picture of the past that resonates with what they see today in terms of what they can read in the paper, I actually think I've had some students who become more interested then because they actually see what politics involves. They're kind of hardened in some ways, but get a better feel for what it means to engage in public service. So I've had a lot of students go into public service. All my classes are structured this way. All my discussions are structured this way. And I think students are open to hearing the real story. I don't think you can just give them a simplistic narrative and tale and expect them to all of a sudden become very passionate because I think they'll be quickly disillusioned. So, they like to learn about Congress. They like to know about, I'll tell one story where I learned about this. I taught a small seminar with a professor named Sean Wilentz on the presidency of George Bush right when it ended. And it was partly a class about how do you study a period in politics right when it comes to a close. And we had guests come in. And one of the guests was Philip Zelikow, who had been the head of the 9/11 Commission, counselor at State Department. He comes in, and we had a 3-hour period, and most of his talk was about the organizational structure of the White House. It wasn't about 9/11, it wasn't about anything sexy. It was literally how the White House functions and who different people are and different roles are. And I admit, at the time I was like, oh my God, this class is not going to go well, and these students are going to, they loved it. Every single one came up to us after the class and said that was the best class in terms of how this really works, how power really unfolds in Washington. And they continue to talk about it during the semester. And that was instructive to me. I think students can be more savvy in discussions of politics. And I've found it, this is a good way to write and talk about it.
On that interesting, hopeful note.
Wait,
I got one more
Sorry.
Last question. So you both are scholars of American history, American presidents, American Congresses. You know something about the Constitution. So as you look forward in the future, are there any structural or political or constitutional changes that you think that would be helpful for our system to be more resilient, to be healthier, to be able to deal with policy issues? I mean, what's the roadmap for the future you think structurally that might be helpful based on what you both have learned?
I mean, that goes back to your question. I've written about money in politics, and I do think we've hit this point because of the Supreme Court decision, because of other factors in the last 10 years, where we're hitting a dangerous period in terms of kind of how money is impacting the legislative process and presidential campaigns, the abandonment of the Watergate reforms by both parties, Obama and Bush. All of this has created, I think, a bad moment in American politics in that respect. And I don't think it's going to be easy to have big changes if you have a status quo that's supported by big dollars like this. So I do think campaign finance reform has to be an issue we talk about again.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.